If Moshiach fulfills the law, wouldn't his sacrifice? As we start trying to return to the Hebrew roots of the faith, returning to his ways, his written Torah, we start assessing our previous beliefs and our previous views and see how or whether they fit with the Torah. As we learn more about the Torah, we start recognizing more of what it commands and what it teaches, and we start looking at our previous beliefs in that light. One of the key assumptions that comes up is regarding the Moshiach fulfilling the law, and this eventually leads us into considering the concept of a messianic sacrifice. The execution described in the Gospels, let's be clear, it was a horrible series of events. It involved great suffering and difficulty. And, of course, it involved the experience of a heavy burden as it took its course. And since we are able to recognize that, we must also recognize that our belief in the Torah requires us to give these events and our understanding of them a thorough and honest assessment, because we care about his Torah and what it commands. If we have had the belief that these events fulfill the Torah, or they represent a sacrifice that fulfills the Torah, then we should be able to take a step back and look at the commands and see what they say. If we know the Torah is true, and that the Torah is the command, then wouldn't something like a messianic sacrifice need to match the requirements of the Torah in order to fulfill it? We know that the Torah is plainly worded, and a sacrifice that fits the standard of the Torah must plainly do so. The purpose of this is to consider what the Torah says. If we focus on what the Torah says and take a lot of effort to study it for itself and to look at it independently of other books, we start to come to a different understanding of the Torah, and we start looking differently at the system that Elohim established. This is something that I have experienced, and it is something that I have witnessed a lot of other people experience on their journey, the journey that is ongoing for all of us, the continued learning that all of us are going through. Focusing on the Torah often results in us coming to new conclusions, different conclusions than we had in the past, things that we may not have been open to or willing to see in the past. And if the Torah is his way, if it is his truth and the foundation of our belief system, then focusing on it, focusing on this truth, should lead us into further truth if we're willing to recognize it. Depending on where we look, the course of events in the Gospels and the execution of the Moshiach according to them might be claimed as a fulfillment of almost everything in the Torah at once. Most commonly, there is this connection with the Passover sacrifice because of the timing and the framing by the Gospels. But a Passover sacrifice is not a sin sacrifice. If someone is willing to recognize that, it might sometimes be linked with other rituals like the Day of Atonement in an attempt to preserve that belief about a sin sacrifice, even though we know it's not on that date, nor is it ever characterized that way. If there is such a connection that fits the Torah commands exactly and fulfills all of the commands, then there should be no issues or no problems with matching the requirements of the Torah. This is what we must assess. The Passover sacrifice. The Gospels strongly imply a connection between the Passover ritual and the events of the execution. This is especially present in the book of John. The Passover commands in Exodus 12, among others, involve a number of requirements that we need to consider. The connections that the Gospels make to the Passover include the date and the bones not being broken. The Gospels position the day of the execution near the time of the Passover. John 19:36 also states that the scripture was fulfilled because no bones were broken. This refers to a requirement given in Exodus 12:46 for the Passover. So we have no bones being broken and a rough match for the date. Should we consider the date and the bone command by themselves, or if it actually was a fulfillment of the Passover, shouldn't we also consider the other Passover commands in the Torah? Exodus 12:5 says it needs to be a year-old sheep or goat. A man in his 30s was not a 1-year-old sheep or goat, not a sheep and not a year old. Exodus 12:3 has 1 sheep or goat per household. This was not done. It was only supposed to be 1 for everyone. That does not match that fundamental feature of the Torah version of the Passover, 1 per household. The execution did not involve slaughtering and cooking. Exodus 12:6-9 describes the process for doing this. The execution was a multi-hour-long process that was not the slaughtering of the animal done by each individual household between the evenings. And it was not followed up by the families cooking the sheep or goat and eating it in haste either. So it was not slaughtered or prepared the way the commands require. Exodus 12:10 says that nothing from the Passover is allowed to remain. We already know it was not eaten, so it does not fit that, and the body was entombed. This does not match the requirements of the Passover because it was allowed to remain. Finally, the Passover is not allowed to be eaten by the uncircumcised. Typically, what comes along with the belief of messianic sacrifice is that it applies for all Gentiles without question. And typically the assumption is that circumcision is not required. Exodus 12:43-48 speaks very differently when we consider the actual Passover. No uncircumcised can partake of the Passover. So if we focus on 1 or 2 things like the Gospel of John does, and we don't pay attention to any of the rest of the specifics of the Torah, then we might be able to make a shaky Passover connection. But doesn't the fulfillment of the Torah warrant following the commands more closely? This highlights one of the key problems we see with presuming a messianic sacrifice. We must pay attention to some details out of context and then not pay attention to the rest of the Torah commands. If someone was trying to do a Passover sacrifice, but he offered a different animal than was commanded, that was a different age than was commanded, that wasn't handled the way it was commanded, it wasn't handled that way in cooking or eating it, and the remainder was handled in a different way than was commanded, would it not be considered different from the Passover sacrifice? If something only matches 8 out of 10 of the requirements, would we say it fulfilled or did not fulfill all of the requirements? Not entirely. It did not fulfill those 2. Furthermore, if it only fulfilled 3 of the requirements out of 10, what would we say? Another issue with the Passover is that the Passover is not a sin sacrifice. This is typically treated as a key point to the messianic sacrifice, that it's supposed to be a universal sacrifice for everyone for all time. Yet it is also supposed to be the Passover sacrifice. The Passover sacrifice is not a sin sacrifice. Exodus 12:26-27 commands us about how we are to teach our children regarding the Passover. The true meaning of the Passover was the striking of Pharaoh's people and the deliverance of Israel from them, according to the Torah. If we say that's not the real meaning of it, would we be following that Torah command, or would we be saying that Exodus 12:27 is inaccurate, that we must instead rely on works other than the Torah to tell us the true meaning? Wouldn't the commanded meaning in the Torah be the true meaning of it? The Day of Atonement sacrifice. Since the Passover is not a sin sacrifice, and since the events of the Gospels do not fulfill the laws of the Passover, sometimes connections are claimed with the Day of Atonement sacrifice. The Day of Atonement rituals are said to provide atonement or covering over all of Israel once a year. So it is already the all-inclusive sacrifice of the Torah. There was already a sacrifice for all sins, and it was already in the Torah. However, the execution in the Gospels was not a Day of Atonement sacrifice. All we have is a claim of symbolism in one aspect. The event surrounding Barabbas being freed is sometimes treated as symbolic of the Day of Atonement, because we have two people being taken before the Roman governor, and one is released while one is executed. But even that comparison by itself is not taken in the context of the Torah commands. No one believes that Barabbas provided atonement for the people, which the scapegoat of the Day of Atonement ritual, according to Leviticus 16:10, does provide atonement. So if Barabbas is treated as the goat being released, then we must assume that he provided atonement also. Additionally, they were not goats. The priest of Aaron did not present them before the tent of meeting. He did not confess the wrongs of the people over the scapegoat and then have a man take it into the wilderness and release it. He didn't sacrifice the other goat and bring the blood inside the tent of meeting, along with all of the other aspects of the ritual in Leviticus 16. It was not done anywhere near the correct date. It wasn't done by the priesthood of Aaron. It did not involve the other sacrifices and the other rituals that accompany it. It did not involve the tent of meeting or the articles of the tent of meeting. If we give Leviticus 16 an honest look, we can see that it is completely different from the execution events in the Gospels. I can understand why someone would want to link a messianic execution to Leviticus 16 because the Day of Atonement sacrifice is the universal sin sacrifice of the Torah. But even the Gospels, which are prone to making those kinds of connections and using things out of context, even they don't try to make that connection. The events of the execution have nothing to do with the Day of Atonement, whether in the timing or in the commands of the ritual. Sin sacrifice. The events of the execution do not match the general sin sacrifices of the Torah either. We can see these requirements in Leviticus 4 and in Numbers 15. And we run into the same kinds of issues that we did with the commands of the Passover and the commands of the Day of Atonement. The priesthood of Aaron is not officiating over it. It's not the right kind of animal. The fat is not burned on the altar. The blood is not taken into the tent of meeting and put upon the two altars. These requirements are not being fulfilled. Blood being shed by itself does not provide atonement. We've probably heard part of Leviticus 17:11 before, which refers to the soul or the vitality of the flesh being in the blood, and that the blood provides atonement. But a key element of that verse is that the blood is given on the altar to provide atonement. The execution did not take place in the tent of meeting, and it did not involve the bronze altar or the gold altar. It does not fit with Leviticus 17:11. Conclusion. To claim a messianic sacrifice, we have to rely on interpreting metaphors or symbols a particular way. We have to rely on taking prophecies out of context, just like the Gospels do, and treating them as symbolic of this. Fundamentally putting the cart before the horse and presuming it must be the case before we get into the details of the Torah. All of this must be done because it does not fit with the Torah. The Torah is about what is plainly commanded and what is plainly required of us, and it does not command us to believe in a sacrifice. If we get into the details of the Torah and deal in the specifics, a messianic sacrifice does not fit with the Torah commands. If the Moshiach and the execution is presumed to fulfill the law, to fulfill the Torah, then we cannot be paying attention to the specifics of the Torah commands. Deuteronomy 10:12 through 13 already tells us what's required of us, what he asks of us. It does not tell us to believe in a sacrifice. It tells us to fear Elohim, to love him, and to walk in all of his ways, and to serve him, and to keep his commandments. This is what he asks of us. None of these things tell us to believe in a future messianic sacrifice. If that is what the Torah requires, then wouldn't it have commanded it? Mercy is already described in Deuteronomy 7:9. He provides mercy to those that love him and guard his commandments for 1,000 generations. Righteousness is already described in Deuteronomy 6:20 through 25. His commands are for our good, for all of the days, and it shall be righteousness for us if we guard to do all of them. Repentance and remembrance of the covenant was already allowed for in Leviticus 26:41 through 45. Even though we broke the covenant, he remembers it. He remembers the covenant that he made with those that he brought out in the Exodus. And he remembers it if we are willing to remember it, if we are willing to return to him and return to his ways. This is what we must do. Our forefathers have inherited false teachings. We must return to his ways in this generation. Deuteronomy 30:1 through 10 tells us about the future restoration of Israel, which will take place because we love him in all of our heart and because we serve him. And in verse 10, because we return to that which is written in his Torah. This is what it hinges upon. We need to return to him and to his ways now.